basically, as you guys have correctly defined, colonialism is a practice where one government dominates another, either a government or a territory that is not yet a state or a government. It could be sort of a tribal territory where there is no government. But when one unit dominates another with the purpose of extracting resources. So that's a major sort of aspect of colonialism that we need to keep in mind, that it's not just domination for the sake of domination, but it's domination with a purpose. And its purpose is to extract resources, whether natural resources, whether labor resources. You know, they want these subjugated people to work for them or do something for them. So that's colonialism in a nutshell. And in this slide, you see everything that's in green and everything that's a sort of square at one point or another was a colony of Great Britain. So you can see how a huge chunk of the world was colonized. And here we're talking about just one nation, Great Britain. France had colonies, Germany, just about every major European power had colonies at one point or another. So that's just to show you the scale of colonialism. And it just happened that when anthropology was born as a science, it happened during this colonial era, towards the tail end of it, but still, you know, for example, when the sort of founding fathers of anthropology worked, like Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Malinowski especially, colonialism was going on. And these anthropologists, you know, like Julia said, and like McGee and Worms are saying, they worked for these colonial governments. So these were not sort of freelance, you know, anthropologists. They were paid a salary, usually by the governments, like Malinowski, and they had a certain task. Even if we look at our very first founding father of American anthropology, Lewis Henry Morgan, he was paid to study Native Americans, and he reported the results of those studies to the American government. And the same the same case was with Malinowski. And so basically, you know, there was an ethical sort of dilemma, because this knowledge that they generated was used by the colonial governments to manage the colonized people more effectively, to extract resources out of them more effectively, to impose their laws on them more effectively. You know, they said, okay, give me the intel, give me the information on how these Papua New Guinean people, for example, will react if we institute a certain law tomorrow. Will they completely freak out and start killing everybody, start killing the officials, or will they kind of be upset, but, you know, go on and put up with it? So this is the type of logic that was going on at the time. And this is one phase of it. So when we're talking about World War II, some very similar things were going on in American anthropology. So for example, anthropologists again were employed by the government, by American government in particular, to study the enemy. So during World War II, the enemy of the United States were Germans and Japanese. As you know, Germans and Japanese were sort of together in coalition in World War II. And so a famous example of this is Ruth Benedict, who is a very famous American anthropologist. You can see her portrait is even printed on stamps in the United States. So one of her most famous works was called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. Chrysanthemum is chrysanthema, right? That's a national flower of Japan. And so this book was basically dedicated to the study of Japanese culture. And what Ruth Benedict was doing, as you can see, this book came out in 1946, right? And as you know, World War II in the areas of Japan went on a little longer than 1945. It sort of ended for us at 1945, but at any rate, this book came out right at the time of World War II. And Ruth Benedict was basically studying the enemy for the American government. And one negative aspect of this was that, I don't know if you guys know this or not, but in the United States, in the western part of the United States, in California, there were Japanese concentration camps. And these were concentration camps not for war criminals, but for Native American Japanese. Basically, in America, in the United States, you know, there is a Japanese diaspora. There are Japanese immigrants. They have lived there for hundreds of years. And when World War II started, the American government was afraid that these Japanese are going to cross sides and they will sort of be this fifth column in the middle of the United States, and they will commit terrorist acts or something like that to support Japan. And so they were afraid, and they put these Japanese who were born in the United States in these concentration camps. And there were hundreds of thousands of people in these camps. And that's sort of one of the dark pages of American history. But this is all part of this same idea of anthropologists participating in stuff like this, that basically had negative results, that had negative results on families and entire cultures and stuff like that. So when anthropologists today look back at these types of practices, this, arises the criticism of these early practices of anthropologists basically being the tools of the government, and sometimes their knowledge and their research was used for something negative. And today, anthropologists, like I told you before, especially cultural anthropologists, they're seen as they fight for the rights of the oppressed, they fight for the rights of the indigenous people, they fight for the rights of the previously colonized, disenfranchised, the poor, the weak. And these are people that are very socially active, they will be at the front lines of any kind of social protest and stuff like that. So, those two kind of don't jibe together very well when we look at these historical incidents and what anthropology is all about now. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind. One thing that I want us in this class to think about is, you guys know that not too long ago, the United States invaded Afghanistan. And so what was happening at the time is that United States military hired social scientists, including anthropologists, to help them in their efforts to instill democracy in Afghanistan. And let's watch a little video about this so you guys get an idea. This kind of practice was called human terrain system. Human terrain system. So let's watch a short video about this human terrain system, and then I will want you guys to discuss this in groups and basically provide your opinions, what you think about this in light of what we have just discussed. So give me just 1 minute. Let me bring up this video.
The Pentagon has a new strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan. An experimental $40 million program called the Human Terrain System has begun enlisting recruits of a different kind to win the battle of hearts and minds. They have graduate degrees in anthropology and serve as cultural advisors to the U.S. military. Some military analysts have hailed the program as the 21st century equivalent of a Vietnam-era military project called CORDS, or Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support. But the move has anthropologists up in arms. They point to the ethical implications of renewing a program like CORDS that assassinated over 26,000 suspected Viet Cong. In September, a group of scholars formed a network of concerned anthropologists, inspired by physicists who opposed the Reagan-era Star Wars program.
We were created from an urgent need in the middle of a war 5 years into it. It was something that was needed now. The focus is humanity. The focus is on the population. Terrain, when you talk about terrain, military people, military professionals, are very comfortable with the idea of terrain. When you put the two together, it gives them a picture of the new environment that they're operating in. In other words, a human terrain that you have to understand the intricacies and the details of, just like you understand that of geographic terrain.
The goal of the program really is to use the knowledge and wisdom and methodologies of social science to enable the military to complete their mission more effectively with less loss of human life, both military and civilian, and to help the military to think about things from somebody else's point of view so that their activities are harmonized, so that they are operating in conjunction, in partnership with those local communities.
Team 1, Mike Williams, team leader here, sir. And we've got 2 others, Moran, who's an analyst, and Steve, who is a research manager.
The US military is expanding a program in Iraq to send teams of anthropologists and social scientists across the country, acting as cultural analysts for US forces.
So we go out to the villages and to the cities and talk to the Iraqis, get an idea of their perceptions, their feelings, basically what they're thinking about their culture. And then we take that back to the military so they have a better understanding of the local population.
The human terrain teams have been portrayed by proponents as nothing more than a kind of hearts and minds campaign. If you look at internal discussions in journals like Military Review, you find that they're more candid about what the aims of the human terrain program are. And according to those sources, human terrain is really about counterinsurgency, really about finding out who the bad guys are, and relating that information up the chain of command.
You know, the strongest argument that people have made who want to convince anthropologists to help in this endeavor is that anthropologists' help will create a more humane approach on the part of the U.S. military towards the Iraqi people. And my argument, and I think the argument of many anthropologists, is that that is a very seductive idea, that you would be able to help in a situation of crisis. What I think one has to step back and ask is, help what? Help whom to do what?
Okay, so give me just 1 second here. So what I want you guys to start thinking about is the pros and the cons of this kind of practice. You know, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages, and, you know, you can provide your opinions on this. But let's do this for a minute. What I'll do, I'll put you guys in your groups.